Well, Gene, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm well, Reverend. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's been fun. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to ask you my favorite question to ask all my guests. What is
Yes.
your best piece of advice you've ever received?
I'm going to give you two because the best piece of advice I would have said to up until a year ago was from my dad. And I was trying to figure out the purchase of a car. It was my first car. I wanted to go used because it would be less expensive. And I was looking at the options and weighing all of that. And his advice to me was don't worry about spending money, just don't waste money. He said, we work for a reason. We make this money for a reason. You can't, and I tend to be I don't want to say miserly. I prefer to call it frugal. And so, I was looking for maybe the cheapest option when really that might not have been the best. And I always lived with that in my heart then after that was don't worry about don't worry about spending it. That's what it's for, but don't waste it. And then a couple of years ago, I was getting some coaching on a new book. The book I'm actually going to read from today, and their stories, they're transformative stories, 12 about dogs that I had worked with at the shelter. That truly, it was nothing less than the hand of God that made these stories go right. They were not trending the right direction. And as I was talking to the coach about developing the book, he said, wow, it sounds like you could really build some nice scripture around those stories. And I said, well, I'd actually considered that, but I wanted it to be for a broader audience. I didn't want to exclude those who might not be Bible readers, um, and just focus on Christians. And he said, "Oh, so you want to water it down?" And I went, "Ooh, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way." I'm like, "No, no, that's not what I said," but that's how it translated. And I really thought through that then and decided to add scripture because it was appropriate. It did make that book better. And yet I transfer it, right, to what other things are going on in your life where are you watering it down? Really? Is that how you want to live? Don't water it down. And so I've kind of taken that to heart as a bit of a motto in the last couple of years. Don't water it down.
I love that because it is so easy because we want to be considerate, but does that
Yes.
mean we're not living out our faith boldly in doing so? And
Right.
so, yeah, it's always that fine line of, especially like as a pastor, how do you make everything not about Jesus, but everything in your life is about Jesus? So,
Yes.
it's
Yeah. And how are you being authentic? Because I
right.
think there are places to pull back, but there are always also places for you to step forward with it.
So tell us the name of your book.
Sure. It's titled Twisty and True Tales of a Shelter Dog Matchmaker. And it's 12 short stories about displaced dogs that took the winding road instead of the straight path to happiness.
So what led you to write that book?
I would say as you move through life, right, you become of a certain age and you look back and see a trend. And yet we both know that it is God's grace that gives it isn't necessarily an age that you hit. But there was a point where I was telling these stories about my work and people went, wow, that would be a really good book. And I hadn't even considered that. And yet I look back and saw this pattern that started in childhood of this, my love for dogs. And I went, huh, that really could be. So I've always written, but throughout my life for myself, mostly in journals and such, just, kind of keeping track of where you're going, pouring out your heart, that kind of thing. And I hadn't ever considered it for public consumption. But once I put these stories together, I realized that they really may be something that people could enjoy.
I love that. So tell us about your journey into being a human resource and rescue person and positivity coach.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been an interesting journey. It's been over 30 years that I was in human resources, and most recently at the Humane Society. I'm now back to being a volunteer there. And it's been it's been, I say, a nice road, right? Because how do you track where you were in your career? There have been some points where I wished I'd taken a different road and wasn't sure that I truly enjoyed being where I was. But for the human resource piece of it, I was at an organization that wanted more coaching for their upper and mid-level managers, and they sent me to train with a coaching group that I really, when you see the impact that working one on one with people has, you just don't ever want to go back. You know, there's something to be said about leading an organization, but for me, it was that one-on-one work that I really enjoyed, and being able to bring it back to the organization and implement it and see the change really meant a lot. And I actually went out and consulted with them for a while and did that specifically because that really is what fed my heart, was helping people see through their challenges and what is it in your mindset. I often say it's less of what you hear yourself telling you as it is what you're feeding yourself. So what are you telling your head? Your head may be telling you all sorts of things that don't serve you well at all, but what are you telling yourself? And so that's what I've really enjoyed about everything to do with the 30 years I've been in that field.
I worked a little bit in human resources on the church side, helping churches find pastors. And what I discovered in the human resource part of it is it's so hard to support organizations who are trying to find people that fit them. And the biggest thing I discovered was they often don't know themselves. And you have to help
Right.
them identify who they are first, because everybody looks great when you look at the resumes, but do they really fit your organization? So, as a human resource person, I'm sure you ran across how do you help people really clearly see themselves accurately?
Yes. And my advice, especially for younger people, is get out in the community and volunteer. It is such a win-win. You're helping your community, you're actually connecting with people out there, and you're creating transferable skills for yourself. You may not necessarily see that doing this actually correlates to doing that, whatever it is that your heart truly wants to pursue. And at the Humane Society, we really look to our volunteer pool when it comes to applications because they get us, right? They've been in the environment, they understand what's involved. So it really helps. It's a real benefit from that perspective.
What is your most rewarding memory of the aspect of working in the Humane Society?
I would say working side by side with people who share the same passion. It is work. And I appreciate you phrasing the question that way because so many people say, oh, you work at a shelter. I could never do that. It must be so depressing. It does take resilience. We see hard cases all the time, neglect and abuse. I can't say it's an easy job, but we're dedicated to making sure every animal that comes through our shelter sees the best happy ending it possibly can. And for me, that is what's so uplifting about it. Just in 2024, we get the stats back at the end of the year, right? And it really proves out. We had over 12,000 adoptions out of our shelter and almost 5,000 return to owners of lost pets. That's huge. I mean, when you consider the impact on our community to providing that service, I don't know how you don't feel good about it. It is very rewarding.
I don't know the history. Can you kind of tell me the history of the Humane Society? I've always heard about it, but never really knew how it was founded or why it was founded.
Yeah, so there's the Humane Society of the Americas, which is an overarching. Now, all of them are independent. So if you donate per se to the Humane Society of the America of the United States, you're not donating to your local humane society. And each humane society runs its own area or division. We're not in any way connected. So it's interesting because we can reach out, and we do frequently, to other large HR, human resource and humane society organizations to see how they're running things. And we're all very compatible and very helpful. Ours in the Pikes Peak region consists of Colorado Springs and Pueblo, which is all southern Colorado. And then there are a wealth of other shelters that do similar work, but aren't necessarily connected to the Humane Society. So we partner with other shelters that might have, for instance, bigger dogs, and bigger dogs take more to feed, are more expensive, have bigger housing needs. And if they're not adopted out as quickly, which is often the case, they come to us because we have a community that will adopt out all size dogs. We also partner with shelters further east and along the southern coast if there are hurricanes coming through, for example, because they want to clear out their shelters, understanding that they're going to have a great need for capacity once those storms hit. So we'll take what's in their shelter to our community and help adopt out those animals to give them room. And we also go and help them in those situations. So it's interesting you ask about the history. It goes back a long way, but each of us are independent in how we operate and who we partner with.
Love that. I just saw a story in our local shelter that a lady who had a love for started out with dogs, also started doing rescue for cats, and now
Wow.
she's got to stop because the cats are so much more expensive and time
Interesting.
consuming. So she's going back to her first passion of dogs because she said she was actually allergic to cats anyway. So her
Oh,
cat
okay.
rescue was is something she added recently.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have a community cat program where we spay and neuter cats, and let them colonize in their area because truly it's the reproductive issue that causes this. And if you can stop the reproductive issue, the cats really aren't harmful to the environment. They actually will benefit, but they just need to be, I don't want to say contained, they need to stop breeding. So that's our effort with community cats. We go out, spay, neuter, and return.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm curious, I always love stories. Stories are always what kind of moves us all. Can you share a memorable story of a dog adoption that particularly touched your heart?
I absolutely can. So, my first story in this book is titled Rover Who Is All Over. And
I love that.
and here's how it goes. The Humane Society is a popular place on Friday afternoons, so I wasn't surprised when there were 6 parties still waiting their turn as notification came over the speakers that visitation would be ending in 20 minutes. As a matchmaker, it was my job to facilitate meetings on a first come, first served basis. The commitment to adopt is determined during these visits, so we don't rush them. The announcement prompted Sue to come over. She introduced herself when she arrived a little past 3 p.m. and had waited patiently since then. She had driven 2 hours for a dog she had seen on our website. Since she was still there, I assumed the dog she wanted to meet hadn't yet been adopted. Will we still get to see our dog? Her voice trembled with concern. After driving that far and waiting that long, I would be concerned too. Yes, I assured her, you are next in line, so someone will be with you shortly. Great, she sighed. We don't want to leave without him. Interesting comment, I thought. Often people keep an open mind about whether a meeting will result in adoption. It sounded like she'd already made up her mind. When we had spoken earlier, I thought she was alone. This time I noticed the man who stood behind her. He was tall, with a thick build, cropped hair, no facial expression, and he did not say a word. I would have been intimidated if I didn't know my fair share of military and policemen. I looked at the emblem on his black shirt, El Paso County Police Department. Just hang in there, I offered. They both nodded and returned to the bench where they'd spent the better part of the afternoon. Dogs had been flying out the door. Which one were they so fond of that hadn't yet been picked? I did a quick sweep of the visitation room to ensure it was clean and grabbed some dog biscuits in case the next canine needed coaxing. I checked the wait list and waved Sue over. It's your turn, I said, smiling. Who would you like to meet? She introduced her husband, Jim, and said, We want to meet Rover. My heart sank. I was briefed on Rover when I arrived, and his notes were clear. Rover pulls on leash, likes to jump, is mouthy, and plays aggressively. I had been candid with others who inquired about him that afternoon. I didn't want to steer them away, but had to make sure they understood what they might be getting into. I pulled Rover's information up on the computer and saw some additional notes about earlier visits. None had resulted in adoption. I worried this would be another failed attempt at a match. Let me tell you what I can about Rover. Jim stepped forward so he could hear. He's a 9 month old German Shepherd mix. He has a ton of energy. He likes to pounce and play rather aggressively. He's 80 pounds and not yet at his full height or weight. He can become mischievous if not exercised frequently. He's mouthy and chews on everything. In short, he is a lot of dog. Earlier in the day, that had been sufficient detail to deter a new mom with an infant tucked on her hip, as well as an elderly gentleman walking with a cane. But Jim just nodded. Sounds like a 9 month old German Shepherd, he said. You're familiar with the breed? My current police partner is a German Shepherd. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the family that Rover had been waiting for? He continued, They are working dogs. They need a purpose. If you don't give them a purpose and encourage them to use their senses and their muscle, they become bored and can get themselves into trouble. I nodded and continued reading Rover's information. It says here that his previous owner, who surrendered him to the shelter, was in the military and got reassigned. He understands commands issued in German. No problem, said Jim. All right, let me show you to the visitation room. Here are some treats. I'd like to meet him first. Then, if it's okay, I'll invite Sue in. I got the officer settled in the room and grabbed a leash to retrieve Rover. Hello, handsome, I said to Rover. He jumped up on the kennel door and towered over me, his hot breath fanning my hair. Not yet at full height or weight? Yikes. This beast looked all German Shepherd, but was massive. I coaxed him down. Hang on, big guy. You need to be on your best behavior. You may be meeting your new forever family. Rover panted and stepped back to let me open the door. As soon as I had the collar on him, he barreled past me and took off, charging down the aisle. Grasping the leash with both hands, I futilely shouted, "Whoa!" and leaned back, putting all my weight in my heels. I was in for a ride, sliding past kennels, trying to steer him sled dog style until he finally slowed when we reached the corner. I skidded to a halt and paused to catch my breath. We turned left and were at the door. I opened it a couple of inches and tried to tell Jim I did not have the situation under control, but Rover knocked me aside and burst into the room. Jim stood up, snapped his fingers 3 times, and pointed to the floor. Rover abruptly sat down, looked up at him with rapt attention. My mouth dropped in awe. Seriously? It was that simple? Jim snapped his fingers again and pointed to the floor. Rover laid down. Jim took a knee to pet Rover's head, and Rover promptly rolled over, chuffing with excitement and wiggling on his back. Jim rubbed his chest. It had to be a record. In less than 30 seconds, I knew this was a match. Should I invite Sue in? I asked. Sure, said Jim. This was the first time I saw him smile. As I walked the paperwork to the adoption desk, I smiled too. How incredible for Rover to be appreciated and allowed to be just how the good Lord made him. There can be nothing better for a dog or a person than to discover your purpose and be encouraged to use all of your unique gifts. Officer Jim and his wife left a half hour later with a new fur family member. Rover walked proudly and properly next to his new humans. Such a joyful day for them and for me. For God to allow me to be the bridge that introduced this family to Rover was such a blessing. I got to witness the invitation and the expressions, both human and canine, of this perfect match. Bible verse. For as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function, so we, being many, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. Romans 12:4 and 5.
I love that story. What a neat story.
Thank you.
So you are a big dog fan,
I am.
and you say your favorite is vintage. What is exactly is a vintage breed?
Yeah, so my husband and I prefer what we call vintage puppies. They're senior dogs, so they're older guys. We joke that if they do not need arthritis medicine, we're not interested. So up until recently, we had four. We lost Sally, who was our 12-year-old Airedale. She had cancer, but was a previous show dog. Absolutely beautiful. Now in the house, we have an 18-year-old toothless Chihuahua. We have a 14-year-old blind pug and a 10-year-old hospice pug. So that's what we call vintage.
I love it. You know, what you do to me is so unique and so special. Um, as you talk about promoting adoption, because we've adopted a cat actually from Humane Society. We never adopted a dog. Someone gave us a dog.
Yeah.
We've never done the dog thing. My kids keep asking for a dog, and I keep saying no because last time we had a dog, I took care of the dog and the kids didn't. So
Uh-huh.
hopefully they aren't listening to this particular podcast. But so tell us, I know they play a special role in the lives of families, especially when you understand what a dog brings. Kind of give us, for those people who may be thinking about a pet, here's your sales pitch to people who may want to adopt a pet.
Yeah, I'm always trying to be mindful, because what works for us doesn't necessarily work for others, right? We like the underdog. There are many people who would prefer a puppy. Dogs are just fabulous. They welcome you when you come home. They get you out to get your steps if you want to be motivated to, live a healthier lifestyle, and they can teach you a few things about how to take a proper nap. But you've got to have the right lifestyle, right? If all of the work is going to be put on you, and in your situation is a great example, and that's not necessarily what you're looking for, then a cat or no animal. I ask people to be mindful, because when we see surrenders at the Humane Society, it's sad, for the animal and for the person, but quite often it's a lifestyle change, or I have to move, or I can't take it, or I can't afford it, whatever it may be. And it's important to consider whether your lifestyle really matches up. There were many years I didn't have a dog. I hope that that's not my situation going forward, but you never know, right? So in doing the right thing by the dog, especially the people who surrender it, they certainly are doing, what's best for the animal, but it's also important for the person to consider what's best for them.
I'm curious how your human resource background helps you with adoption, because I'm sure that you bring some of that into the matches. So how does that work for you?
Yeah, so I feel like I support the people who support the dogs, right? So it all connects. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm in this, for the animals." In fact, when I started volunteering, what I had really wanted to do was dog walk. I went, I deal with people all day. This will be a nice break. I can just walk dogs. And what I heard back after I had applied was, you'd be really good at matchmaking and we could use some help matchmaking. And I'm like, oh, dealing with people, and they're like, but you're good at it, right? So, and how far be it from me to say, no, I don't want to do that when they're saying this is what we really need assistance in. And I got to tell you, the Lord just blessed me with all these great stories of these matches that I'm not saying I was able to make, right? The people come in knowing who they want to meet. And it's just really neat to be a part of that whole experience. And so truly do follow your heart with what it is that you want to do, but be open to what else might really be tapping you, and you go, well, I don't know, just try it, why not?
So what feedback are you getting back from your book?
Oh, such wonderful feedback. I had my launch party at the Humane Society, so that was a blast. And it was open to staff and volunteers. And what it's really prompted me to do is look for more stories, right? There's always more stories. So are you living that opportunity too? And it's kind of taught me to be more mindful, right? When you're preaching, if you say, to other people, are you really taking your own advice? And so it's kind of been interesting to look at the mirror and go, yeah, are you doing that? Is that you? Is that still you? Is it you going forward?
I love it. So tell us another story. I'm sure you have another story you'd like to share.
Well, I want to talk about fostering too. And I had an interesting experience. I don't want everyone to think that this is how it goes, but this was my experience. We often ask if dogs are going to be in the shelter for a while, or if they're especially skittish and aren't, you know, doing well with being handled, for foster families to come forward, both for cats and dogs, just to help them through that intermittent time before they're adopted. It was a point a year ago where we had 3 dogs already, and someone reached out to me because they know I love pugs and said, "Hey, did you see this pug?" And I said, "Well, I did, but I thought he came in with a partner, right? I thought he was a bonded pair, meaning they would be moved together because they are inseparable in how they relate to each other." No, they weren't a bonded pair. And in fact, the female dog had been adopted out already, and the male, 10-year-old male, was still in the shelter. His issue was he needed much attention. He needed to have teeth removed. He needed to be neutered. He needed to be checked for a herniated disc, and they were treating him for worms. So all of this was going to take time. And I'm like, what a poor thing, right? 10 years old, you came in with a buddy. Now your buddy's gone, and you've got a long list of vet appointments that they can't do, but over the course of weeks. And so I talked to my husband. He was aggravated, and I can't say I blame him. We already have 3 dogs. We don't need another dog. I said, I'm just talking about fostering him. They need a foster for 4 to 6 weeks. How is that going to work? I'm like, honey, I honestly don't know. I'm not going to tell you I got it all figured out. It just seems like we should try. And he said, okay. So I brought Morty home. 10-year-old slip disc, bad teeth, needs to be neutered little dog. And back and forth we went, and he got along great in our house. And he went through his surgeries, and it was the last visit that we had at 6 weeks before he should have been adopted out. And the deworming treatment was not working, which meant he still had bloody stools. And so they expected that was the problem. And I brought him in, and the herniated disc, there wasn't a whole lot they could do with, but everything else had been complete. And I said, look, there's still this issue. And they said, well, we don't understand then if this should have worked. So they took an x-ray of his stomach, and they found a mass in his colon that was inoperable. And I got that information later that day. So they had kept him there during the day. And I got off the phone and I cried, because how disappointing, after now you've had this dog for 6 weeks thinking that you're preparing him for a new home, and they can't adopt him out because he's old, he's got these issues, he's got slip disc, he's not healthy enough to undergo the surgery. And so I composed myself, because I thought that was only fair, before I called my husband, because I understood this wasn't what he was getting into in the first place. And I just told him, I said, and here's the deal. And without hesitation, he said, so we're keeping him, right? Ugh, that's why I love this man. I'm like, yes, I would like to keep him for however long we have him. And we still do. It's been a year. His health has not improved, but we understood that, right? So we knew what we were getting into in the beginning. But what a joy he's been to our house, just to, for whatever length of time we have him, really appreciate and I hope we've made his life a little better too, because he's really a hoot. So yes, there you have it. Remember, you don't have to make a long-term commitment to foster, but if my story is of any value, it could happen. You could just fall in love.
Oh, that's great. I love to ask my guests this question too. This has been a great conversation. What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh gosh. Um, it's kind of hard to figure when you're in the middle of it, right?
Right.
If if someone could say about me that I encouraged them and that I was a good and faithful servant, I that would be phenomenal.
That's amazing. As we wrap up our time together, what key takeaways do you want to leave with our audience?
Leave time for God. Leave that space. I'm a positivity coach, and I try to consider every day. I have a busy schedule, and often I get wrapped up and I don't have time. But if you are telling yourself you don't have time, guess what? You're not going to have it. And so consider where you might flip your script, if you will. Um, I try and be very mindful about considering every morning that I have more than enough time. There's more than enough time for interruptions. There's more than enough time for what God wants to do in your life, because often you don't put that on your calendar. Take a break. Listen to God. What is He telling you? Where does He need you to work? There was a time, Keith, when I would prefer not to be interrupted, right? I had things to do, I had a tight schedule. And it was just last year when somebody walked into my office after I'd just gotten off the phone with my boss. He was waiting in a meeting room for statistics that I said I could pull for him in 5 minutes, and I would bring to that meeting so that he would have them to deliver. And as soon as I hung up the phone, this person walked in. She didn't knock. She was sobbing. She closed the door, just said my name. She said, Jean, and just sat down and cried. I'm a very empathetic crier. So her crying made me start to cry. I came over with a box of Kleenex and I just handed her one and I said, can you tell me what we're crying about? And she kind of chuckled and said, my grandmother just passed away. I got word as I parked the car in our parking lot, and I just had to come here. And I am embarrassed to say there was a time when I would have listened to her, cleaned her up with some Kleenex, pat her on the back, sent her back out because I had something important that was delivered. And I just sat there with her because I realized in that moment that this is what God brought me today. She needed me more than any report that needed to be delivered to a meeting. And I sat with her. And after some time, we were able to take a breath. We talked about where her grandmother was. She was very instrumental in her teenage years and now lived in another state. And how are we going to get back there? What kind of bereavement time was available? How would she spend that time? And really created a plan that made her feel more confident walking out, that she was going to be okay with this, that she was going to make it through. And as we opened the door and she exited, down the hall came my boss and noticed the tear stained face as she walked away and looked at me and said, you couldn't get me that report. And I went, I couldn't get you that report. I'm really sorry. And he said, it's okay. And I really appreciated that. I appreciated the graciousness with which he accepted that. And I appreciated that, the knowledge, right? The wisdom that God allowed me to spend time with her where you need to be. It's not always on your schedule. I'm just saying it's not always on your schedule. So consider where you're needed and how you can offer the world that kindness, because
Uh,
the world needs kindness right now.
yeah, it definitely does. What a neat story. Where can people find and buy your book and connect with you on social media?
Sure. So you can find me at dogauthor.com. It's DOGAUTHOR.com. And you'll find links to my books. Everything's on Amazon. I have a collection of children's books as well. So I hope people come and enjoy it.
Well, thanks, Gene, so much for sharing your story and what you do is so important to changing and transforming lives and families and the lives of dogs. So thank you for what you do.
And thank you, Keith. Thank you for this platform you've created and for guests that you have on. It really is very inspiring. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.